Mexico was excluded from reciprocal tariffs announced April 2nd. Read the story. Tariff-free is some dealers' latest sales pitch before levies announced by the Trump administration increase prices of many vehicles and parts. Some are adding the tariffs as a line item on the vehicle details page to set expectations. Read the story. Ineos Automotive, dependent on a single factory in France for vehicle output, will raise prices for US-bound vehicles as the small-volume brand combats new tariffs in its largest market. Read the story. Some Nissan workers in Tennessee under threat from the troubled carmaker's latest cost-cutting plans may get a reprieve thanks to the Trump tariffs. Read the story. A changed used vehicle market tested Carvana in 2022. 3 years later, the company is primed to meet used vehicle supply and demand shifts, including those arising from tariffs, analysts say. Read the story. Hyundai and its Genesis brand are determined to find their way in the new trade landscape, but the path is tricky if not treacherous. In the immediate wake of President Donald Trump's announcement of sweeping auto tariffs, Hyundai Motor CEO Jose Munoz said the company would not hike prices as a knee-jerk reaction. Read the story. Mercedes-Benz Group is considering shifting the production of another model to the US in response to President Donald Trump's 25% auto tariffs. The move may be necessary to deal with the cost of the duties, Mercedes production chief George Berzer said, declining to comment on which model may be moved to its factory in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Read the story. Infiniti has paused production of 2 Mexico-built crossovers for the US market in response to the tariffs on imported vehicles. Read the story. Read the story. General Motors is moving to increase production of light-duty trucks at its Fort Wayne, Indiana, assembly plant, it said in a webcast for plant employees April 3rd. Read the story. Automakers, suppliers and retailers mostly saw drops in share price after President Donald Trump's tariffs took effect. Here's a look at the Wall Street impact. See the chart. Stellantis is temporarily letting go nearly 1,000 workers in the US as it pauses production at some plants in Canada and Mexico in response to the tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump. The layoffs affect workers at 5 plants in Michigan and Indiana, a company spokesperson said. Read more. Stellantis said Trump's auto tariffs will lead the automaker to idle production at its assembly plant in Windsor, Ontario, starting April 7th. Read the story. Read the breakdown. Tariffs on US vehicle imports, which began April 3rd, could upend the highly integrated automotive supply chain in North America, analysts and economists say. Read the story. Ford Motor Company is making employee discounts available to all customers for the next 2 months, offering what can be several $1,000s in savings on most vehicles as tariffs threaten to raise prices. Read the story. Kia aims to sell more electric vehicles in Europe as President Donald Trump's auto tariffs and anti-EV policies cloud the outlook in the US. Read the story. European automakers and suppliers woke up to a new world April 3rd. Products they sell in the US will now face 25% tariffs as part of far-reaching moves by President Donald Trump to increase domestic investment in manufacturing. Read the story. With President Trump's reciprocal tariffs, trading partners will have rates that vary based off levies, taxes and trade barriers other nations place against the US. But autos are not part of his reciprocal tariff plan. They won't stack on top of the already announced 25% tariffs on vehicles imported into the US market. That tariff starts April 3rd. Read the story. President Donald Trump said the US will implement a reciprocal tariff on its trading partners, with rates varying based off levies, taxes and trade barriers other nations place against the US. All nations are subject to a tariff of at least 10%, Trump said April 2nd at the White House. It was not immediately clear when they will go into effect. The new tariffs are designed to incentivize US manufacturing while raising federal revenue, Trump said. It was not immediately clear how the US calculated other nations' tariff rates. The tariffs come as the auto industry prepares for tariffs on automotive imports that begin April 3rd. John Irwin. Read the story. President Donald Trump is expected to unveil a sweeping new round of tariffs on U.S. trading partners as the auto industry braces for new levies on vehicle imports to go into effect April 3rd. Trump is scheduled to detail the latest levies at 4 p.m. Eastern on April 2nd during an event at the White House. Read more. Join us at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on April 3rd for a live talk with industry leaders on the Trump administration's tariffs and their impact on the auto industry. Attend the live and leave a question for the panelists. U.S. consumers, spooked by the threat looming tariffs may pose to new vehicle prices in coming weeks and months, gave a major lift to retail sales last month. Read the story. Hyundai Motor Company warned U.S. dealers it is evaluating its pricing strategy in the face of forthcoming 25% tariffs on imported vehicles and parts announced by Trump. Randy Parker, CEO of Hyundai and Genesis Motor North America, told dealers in a note that current vehicle pricing is not guaranteed and may be subject to change for units wholesaled after April 2nd. Read the story. Canada and Mexico won protections against potential new U.S. auto tariffs in 2018 as part of the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement on Trade, but there is no evidence that Trump will honor those commitments as he imposes 25% duties on global automotive imports. Read the story. Trump said he couldn't care less if automakers raise car prices in response to the planned tariffs on imported vehicles. Trump was asked in an interview with NBC News on March 29 whether he warned foreign automaker CEOs not to raise consumer prices in response to the 25% tariffs he plans to impose on their products April 3rd. Read the story. Whether U.S. tariffs on imported vehicles achieve the president's goal of revitalizing domestic auto manufacturing remains to be seen, but the levies that start April 3rd are almost certain to push up the prices of new models if they stay in force for more than a few months. Across the country, buyers and sellers are rushing to lock down deals and fill lots before they take effect. Read more. A group representing General Motors, Toyota Motor Corporation, Volkswagen Group, and other major automakers warned U.S. consumers will be hurt by the 25% tariffs President Donald Trump plans to impose April 3rd on imported vehicles. Read the story. The pair of automakers responsible for producing 2/3 of the vehicles built in Canada last year is standing firmly behind their Canadian manufacturing footprints, as the global auto industry faces punishing tariffs on imports into the United States. Read the story. Read the story. Trump said he had an extremely productive call this morning with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who described it as a constructive conversation. Read the story. The tariffs on imported vehicles and parts will raise costs across the industry, but Tesla's relatively high level of U.S. content could give it an advantage over rivals. Read the story. Cracks could soon begin to show as tariffs pile up on manufacturing supply chains, experts warn. Michigan, home to the Detroit 3 automakers, hundreds of supplier bases, and a manufacturing-reliant economy, is among the most vulnerable to trade and supply disruptions. Read the story. Trump's 25% tariffs on imported cars and parts could reduce Stellantis' earnings this year by 75%, according to a report by investment bank Jefferies. Read the story. Virtually all analysts predict the 25% tariffs President Donald Trump plans to levy on automotive imports April 2nd will raise vehicle prices by thousands of dollars, decimate automaker profits, and hamper North American production. UAW President Shawn Fain disagrees. Read the story. The president said U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican Louisiana, is working on providing consumers with a tax deduction for interest paid on auto loans for vehicles made in the U.S. Read the story. Read the story. Automotive dealers are emphasizing their resilience and adaptability amid the Trump administration going forward with 25% tariffs for vehicles built outside the U.S. They've also been left scrambling for details. Read the story. The Trump administration's persistent threats to slap tariffs on new light vehicles and parts built outside the U.S. now set to become a reality in early April likely helped drive U.S. sales growth in March, according to J.D. Power and other analysts. Read the story. Trump's tariffs on automobile imports set to take effect next week are expected to drive up costs across the industry, raising sticker prices by thousands of dollars. The effects could be particularly pronounced at the low end of the market. Read the story. The momentum for Canadian-built cars mirrors the wider movement in Canada that has seen buyers leave U.S. produce to rot on grocery store shelves, cancel big tech subscriptions, and blacklist U.S. vacation destinations. Read the story. Ontario Premier Doug Ford said on March 27 he was told by U.S. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick this week that Canadian-made vehicles with 50% or more American parts will not face the tariff set to hit all imports into the United States next week. Read the story. Ferrari, in a statement on March 27, said U.S. pricing for 3 of its model families, the Ferrari 296, SF90, and Roma, will remain unchanged after April 3. But the company said more popular models such as the Purosang, 12-cylindry, and F80 will be subject to U.S. price increases of up to 10%, in coordination with dealers. The upcoming auto tariffs are the latest to send shockwaves through the global supply chain, but they're not the only ones the industry has to grapple with. This breakdown details tariffs that are in effect today, what's coming down the line, and how they are quickly compounding. Read the breakdown. The U.S. luxury vehicle market held its own during the COVID-19 pandemic and chronic chip shortage but appears primed for disruption by the latest industry headwind, President Donald Trump's 25% tariffs on vehicles built outside the U.S. Read the story. Now that President Donald Trump is moving ahead with tariffs worldwide, Mexico can at least ensure its exports to the U.S. get a lower fee than others, Economy Minister Marcelo Ebrard said. Read the story. President Donald Trump suggested further tariffs would be imposed on the European Union and Canada if they work together to do economic harm to the U.S. Read the story. U.S. President Donald Trump's imposition of 25% tariffs on all imported vehicles and auto parts has Canadian industry stakeholders reeling and seeking clarity on the impact of the latest salvo in the ongoing trade war with Canada's southern neighbor. Read the story. Europe's automotive sector condemned Trump's executive order imposing 25% tariffs on imported cars, as well as many components, but also called for negotiations and expressed cautious optimism that a compromise could be reached. Read the story. Ontario Premier Doug Ford promises to inflict as much pain as possible on the American people in retaliation to U.S. President Donald Trump's 25% tariffs on automobile imports. Ford governs the only jurisdiction in North America that is home to 5 automakers, operating 8 assembly plants in the province as well as engine and transmission factories. Read the story. The U.S. will implement a 25% tariff on vehicles built outside the U.S., Trump said March 26. The tariffs go into effect April 3, Trump said. The tariffs are a major escalation in Trump's trade agenda and could cause massive ripple effects throughout global automotive supply chains already reeling from other new levies, retaliatory measures, and a lack of long-term clarity on trade policy. Read the story. President Donald Trump's conflicting statements on tariffs sowed more confusion in the auto industry as automakers rushed to curry favor with the White House ahead of April 2. Read the story. President Donald Trump said he will announce tariffs on automobile imports in the coming days, and indicated nations will receive breaks from next week's reciprocal tariffs. Trump's comments at the White House on Monday sowed further confusion about his plans for a sweeping tariff announcement scheduled for April 2nd. Read the story. The Trump administration is unlikely to implement a tariff on automotive imports on April 2nd, according to media reports over the weekend. Such a move would be a welcome development for automakers and suppliers that have warned of new levies straining the supply chain. Read the story. Ford Motor Company produced nearly 400,000 F-Series Super Duty pickups at 2 factories in the United States in 2024. Conversely, every engine came from Canada or Mexico. That now has the makings of one costly problem for the automaker. Read the story. It wasn't long ago when many automakers and suppliers were dismissive of the threat tariffs posed to their businesses. The consensus among them was that tariffs would only be a negotiating tool Trump would use to reach deals with other nations on trade and immigration. That's no longer the case. Read the column. When Karma Automotive President Marquez McCammon hatched a new strategic direction for the Southern California brand in 2023, moving upmarket to ultra-luxury, the veteran auto industry executive also aimed to reduce the company's reliance on parts sourced from China. What Karma did not anticipate was possible changes to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, a trade pact negotiated during President Donald Trump's first term. Read the story. A growing number of auto manufacturers see rising tariffs and escalating trade wars as the most serious crisis the industry has faced in recent years. The tariff pressure could eclipse the supply chain chaos during the pandemic and semiconductor shortage, which paralyzed global auto production and led to tens of millions of vehicle cuts worldwide. Read the story. Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum has maintained a cordial tone with Donald Trump despite the U.S. president's threats to sink the Mexican auto industry and the broader economy with a 25% tariff. Read the story. The trade war ignited by Trump is poised to hike assembly costs for automakers in North America, raising prices for new vehicles in Canada and sending buyers flocking to the relative safety of the used car market. Read the story. Nissan told dealers it has cranked up production in Mexico ahead of a potential 25% tariff on vehicles imported to the U.S. If Trump keeps the tariffs for an extended period, Nissan might have to pass on some of the cost to customers. Read the story. Japan's auto industry is bracing for potentially significant production cutbacks at home if U.S. tariffs on auto shipments go ahead in 2 weeks, as automakers including Toyota, Honda, and Nissan scramble to limit damage to the domestic export engine and supply chain. Read the story. Ford is stockpiling parts that comply with the U.S. Mexico-Canada agreement, reassessing cross-border operations and telling suppliers to keep shipping under existing contract terms as it weighs the impact of tariffs. Read the story. The Canadian government says it will impose 25% tariffs on U.S. goods worth $21 billion in retaliation for the 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum the Trump administration imposed March 12. Read the story. Automakers and suppliers are bracing for impact as tariffs proposed by Trump threaten to destabilize the supply chain. But the industry has become accustomed to such turbulence. The coronavirus pandemic, the microchip shortage, and the transition to electric vehicles forced automakers to reshape parts networks during the past few years. Read the story. Trump said he was re-evaluating plans to double steel and aluminum tariffs on Canada to 50% after Ontario announced it would suspend a 25% surcharge on electricity sent to the U.S. Read the story. All U.S. steel and aluminum imports will be subject to at least a 25% tariff beginning March 12, as the auto industry braces for a host of other duties to go into effect April 2nd. Read the story. President Donald Trump doubled his planned tariff on all steel and aluminum products coming into the United States from Canada, bringing the total to 50%, in response to the province of Ontario placing a 25% tariff on electricity coming into the U.S. Read the story. Canada will keep in place its retaliatory tariffs against U.S.-made products as long as President Donald Trump persists with a trade war, said Mark Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister-designate. The Canadian government is rightly retaliating with our own tariffs, Carney said at his victory speech March 9, according to Bloomberg. My government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect and make credible, reliable commitments to free and fair trade. Read the story. President Donald Trump's plan for significant tariffs on vehicles produced in Canada and Mexico would probably be a mixed bag for the auto loans and leases tied to a significant proportion of dealership profits. Read the story. President Donald Trump said tariffs on Mexico and Canada could go higher than a 25% rate imposed earlier this week, injecting further uncertainty into trade policies that have rattled markets and left businesses on edge. Read the story. President Donald Trump will exempt Mexican and Canadian goods covered by the North American Trade Agreement known as USMCA from his 25% tariffs, offering major reprieves to the U.S. two largest trading partners. Read the story. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick on March 6 said the one-month reprieve on hefty tariffs on goods imported from Mexico and Canada that has been granted to automotive products is likely to be extended to all products that comply with the USMCA. Read the story. UAW President Shawn Fain spent much of 2024 deriding President Donald Trump as a scab who would be a complete disaster for the working class, while Trump blamed Fain for the union's woes and called for his firing. But Fain is among the few high-profile figures in the auto industry to publicly support Trump's 25% tariffs on imports from Mexico and Canada that analysts have said could wipe out Detroit 3 profits, crimp production, and add thousands of dollars to the price of a new vehicle. Read the story. Mexico has played a crucial production role for Volkswagen Group in North America, especially for its namesake and Audi brands in the US market. Read the story. Auto supplier Linamar Corp. isn't contemplating shuttering plants in Canada or Mexico and shifting production to the US, despite the tariffs. Read the story. The Trump administration's goal to lure manufacturers to the US to avoid hefty tariffs could backfire with some automotive suppliers. A third of US suppliers said they would move production outside the US if 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico persisted for 6 months, according to a February survey by MEMA Original Equipment Suppliers, which represents US parts makers. Read the story. The auto industry is embracing relief from tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico that could overturn the North American supply chain. But the reprieve is only temporary. Read the story. For automotive retailers, Trump's 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico could be cause for whiplash. Read the story. Stellantis said it shares Trump's goal of building more cars in the US, as it thanked him for granting a 1-month exemption from tariffs on Canada and Mexico. Read the story. President Donald Trump will exempt automakers from his punishing 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico for 1 month as long as they comply with the terms of an existing free trade agreement, the White House said March 5. Read the story. Car buyers will have to absorb more of the tariff impacts than consumers purchasing other goods because of several auto industry idiosyncrasies, including the uniqueness of automotive parts, the supplier financial picture and customer brand loyalty. Read the story. Some Forvia customers have accepted contract modifications to cover the costs of tariffs for imported parts, said Francois Tardif, Executive Vice President for North America. The company is working with customers on a case-by-case basis, said CEO Martin Fisher. They spoke with reporters briefly on March 5 in Detroit. Late last month, Forvia CFO Olivier Durand had said that the supplier would need to pass on the entire tax to customers. We can't do otherwise, he said. Jamie Butters. Read the story. Here's an overview of the tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China, and how they jibe with previous trade policies and tariff rates. Read the story. Unifor President Lana Payne said she harbors no illusions about how hard the Union and Canadian government will need to fight to keep the country's automotive industry intact as US President Donald Trump targets Canada with tariffs. Read the story. US. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick said in an interview Wednesday morning on Bloomberg TV that he expects Trump will make an announcement regarding the tariffs on Canada and Mexico this afternoon. Lutnick suggested the tariffs will remain at 25% but said some categories of goods might be exempted, including the auto sector. Read the story. President Donald Trump acknowledged that there may be an adjustment period as his sweeping tariffs take effect but defended his push to remake the U.S. economy in a primetime address to a joint session of Congress on March 4.